So one thing I have always appreciated about the story of Black Clover is just how easy it is to get into. The story in general is pretty simple to grasp, and there always seems to be something interesting going on. And so as the series has progressed to what is now over 300 chapters of its manga, we have gone from event to event in a pretty cohesive manner that takes shonen escalation, and rather than using it as a way to repeatedly one-up itself, does so in a way that feels like it has been planned from the very beginning. And so with that, although in the moment events may feel exceedingly climactic, even when we're made to progress onwards, it's not a drag at all, but instead serves to expand our understanding of this world, its inhabitants, and history. And on that note, for a pretty long time, one of the biggest questions in the series, which actually originated from its very first chapter, was in regards to the origins of ASTA'S power. Now, between the Elf Invasion arc and the preparations for the Spade Kingdom raid arc, many of our questions in this case have actually been answered. We know the devil that resides in ASTA'S grimoire to be Libe, his adoptive brother. And we furthermore know that very grimoire to have once belonged to the leader of the elves, Light. Light was a user of sword magic who once wielded 3 of ASTA'S blades: the Demon Slayer sword, the Demon Dweller sword, and the Demon Destroyer sword. However, because only the Demon Slayer sword was within the grimoire when Asta first found it, the question still remains how they got there. And even more than that, where did they come from to begin with? I mean, these are not magical swords. In fact, they are anti-magic weapons, tangible artifacts that did not simply spring forth into existence out of nowhere. Yet again, Light was accredited to being their former wielder. And truthfully, it's a bit of an odd clash of aesthetics. Elves in fiction, and clearly in Black Clover as well, are generally more in touch with nature and its natural occurrences as opposed to something like smelted metal weaponry. In fact, when working with the first Wizard King, the combination of elven magic application and human magic item technology was proposed, which is to say that this was more than likely an area of expertise they were lacking in. And even more than that, beyond their ultimate calamity and downfall, which was orchestrated by the devil Zagreed and resulted in Light being made into a demon, which by the way they did not know about at the time, isn't the name scheme of these weapons a bit odd? Well, it is our belief that the true craftsmen behind Asta's various weapons were in fact the dwarves. Dwarves being yet another humanoid race. We have very little information on them and have yet to encounter a full-blooded dwarf just yet. However, when briefly spoken of, it wasn't as if they were readily known about or encountered. A peasant like Asta was completely unfamiliar, and even a noble like Mimosa had only ever heard about them by way of old tales, described to be another race separate from the elves who lived in the distant past and possessed unique skills. And within the associated imagery provided, we are able to see your typical fantasy dwarf, from the short and stout stature to the incredible facial hair, not to mention a bit of ore and an axe in hand. Now, it's unclear what exactly may have happened to the dwarves to have made their presence on the continent so generally unknown, but at the very least, we are able to surmise 2 things. First, with Charmy being half dwarf, half human, at least one dwarf must have been alive 20 years ago. Second, because Lyra, the elf who had possessed Rill, was familiar with the feeling of dwarven magic, their people were likely prominent at a similar point in time and even interacted with the elves. And interestingly enough, despite Lyra's hatred for humans at the time, in realizing Charmy to be a half-dwarf, there was suddenly somewhat of a reluctance to fight her. Not in a fear of defeat perhaps, but more so of a racial respect. Now, assuming that the dwarves did in fact forge these swords, for what purpose would they have done so? And furthermore, why would they have been wielded by an elf? Well, weapons are made for lethal force and combat, and with names like these, it is pretty clear that they were intended to face threats stemming from the underworld, specifically in relation to those brought forth by the Tree of Clyphot's growth. Because yes, the current intentions of the devils have actually come to fruition once before in ancient times, as confirmed by Queen Lolopechka and the archive of information and knowledge she had inherited from her predecessors. A horrifying history in which it would be concluded that such an advent would result in the deaths of over 90% of the continent's population and the end of the world. And so if a previous Heart Kingdom royal experienced this point in history, we can pretty much conclude that the elves, dwarves, and humans fought together against this fiendish threat and prevailed victorious in the end. And with this sort of union, it may be presumed that these blades were provided to the elves by the dwarves. In the vast majority of cases, different types of magic are hereditary, and with elven mana being so abundant, I wouldn't be surprised to know that this was even more so in their case. And so with Light using sword magic and also being the leader of the elves, we're left with the impression that these blades were made for his ancestor by the dwarves and were furthermore passed down through the generations for the sake of combating such threats for all time. I mean, the sheer fact that Megekula was so perturbed by the introduction of anti-magic into the fray by Asta speaks volumes as to how troublesome the power happens to be for them to deal with. Now, this accounts for their overall creation surely, but what of their placement? Again, these three weapons were scattered. The Demon Slayer sword was left in the 5-leaf grimoire by Light, which is easy enough, but as for the Demon Dweller and Demon Destroyer swords, they were both located in 2 different dungeons. Now, for those of you who may not remember, dungeons are ancient landmarks of mysterious origins which emerge in certain locations without any warning. And this concept itself was introduced very early on into the series, and to this day, despite several being explored throughout the story, we still know very little about them. And at that, considering the brilliance of the architecture, contents of incredible arcane relics, and the unifying theme of these things emerging from the underground, I feel it is pretty safe to say the dungeons were also created by the dwarves. And furthermore, that if humans cannot predict the emergence of dungeons, the dwarves could very well be thriving to this day just below the surface. And with how horrific the abyssal invasion seemed to be in the past, I would liken this to be similar to resorting to fallout shelters as to protect themselves from further atrocities. And at that, because we were able to surmise that the dwarves were likely in prominence around the same time as the elves prior to their genocide, they may have resorted to such practices after seeing what the humans had done to the elves. And so yeah, they opted to segregate themselves from the rest of the continent's populace, which may start to explain why Charmy was completely unaware of her dwarven heritage, which implies an absent parent. But be this as it may, how would these 2 swords have possibly made their way back into dwarven possession? Well, we certainly know it was not Light's doing. However, Light did in fact sire twin children. One unfortunately perished in the womb, but the other, thanks to narrow sealing magic at the time, was able to survive along with their mother, Lady Tetia. And with Lady Tetia being a human, this resulting child was in fact a half-human, half-elf hybrid. And as we've learned from the case of Charmy, it is said that sometimes racial hybrids may be capable of possessing 2 different types of magical attributes, and we believe this may have been the case with Light's child as well. And as previously stated, Light himself possessed sword magic we presume to have been passed from generation to generation. However, the child's mother, Lady Tetia, a royal and sister of the first Wizard King, would have also possessed especially powerful mana. And interestingly enough, despite being of virtually no significance to the events at hand, it was expressed that she possessed wind magic. And this is important because it provides further credence to our belief that Light's child was responsible for the relocation of these swords. If you remember, the Demon Dweller sword was found in the very same dungeon that Yuno found the wind spirit Sylphin. It stands to reason that each of these weapons were scattered and placed in the most well-fortified locations possible, as beyond sometimes being within grand magic zones, which are locations of naturally abundant and exceedingly powerful mana that may prove fatal for the unequipped, they were inside dungeons which are trapped to the extreme. Now we know that ASTA'S mother discovered the 5-leaf grimoire herself, but not specifically where as compared to these 2. Now, in the midst of raiding the dungeon housing the Demon Destroyer sword, when Sylph first encountered the presence of Light, she had a bit of a reaction to his mana. Now mind you, this was incredibly brief, but other than this, Sylph has never really taken stock of anyone's mana aside from Yuno's. And so it would stand to reason that if she once inhabited the grimoire of Light's child, the mana of Light himself would bear some degree of similarity. And at that, Sylph was not found in a grimoire at all, but rather a scroll. One that was written in a script unlike any other we have ever seen, not even the elves, so again, we are left to consider dwarven influence. Now, the reason Light's child felt compelled to scatter these relics, once wielded by their late father, remains unknown, but perhaps on account of the elf tribe being no more, they felt they would be better suited elsewhere and return to their creators. They themselves from then on residing in Elysia, as this is where their descendants now remain. Friends, the world of Black Clover is one chock full of intrigue and plenty of connecting points of fascination, and I hope you were able to enjoy our dabbling into its contents enough to consider subscribing to Plot Armor with notifications on for plenty more to come. We are well on our way to 300,000 subscribers and could certainly use your help in making that a reality. If you'd like to get your hands on some volumes of Black Clover or any other manga series out there, please use our RightStuf affiliate link in the description below, as it does help out the channel. Because when it comes to bringing you some of the best Black Clover content on the platform, Plot Armor has you covered. As always, I'm Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.